happens when a rule is enforced for one group and not enforced for the other. And yes, we're going to talk about the World Cup, but it's also about something bigger. It's about the enforcement of rules. I actually started thinking about this last year during my summer in New York. I grew up in Irvine, California, where you don't cross the street on red even if there's no one on the road. In New York, the system is far more intuitive. You cross the street when you decide it's safe to cross, regardless of what color the light is. And I'm persuaded that the second system is more efficient, but of course it also requires judgment. And when you give people more discretion, some people are going to make bad calls. It happens every day. And New Yorkers seem to be okay with that trade-off. New York actually decriminalized jaywalking in 2025. Prior to that, jaywalking tickets were rarely handed out. 90% of the tickets given were to, you guessed it, people of color. I think about sports. I think about VAR, which stands for Video Assistant Referee. In theory, video review should make the game more fair. We have the technology. We can slow things down. We can see what the referee missed. We can zoom in until a man's ass cheek becomes a constitutional issue. But suddenly, there are new questions. When is VAR used? When is it ignored? How far back do we review? Why can't the audience always see the raw footage alongside the official interpretation? And if a system meant to create fairness is still being selectively applied, then what did we actually fix? And then I think about the legal system. I think about how much of legal training is learning that the rule is never just about the rule. It's the rule plus the exception, plus the standard of review, plus prosecutorial discretion, plus judicial interpretation, plus who can afford a good lawyer, plus whether the person applying the rule sees you as a full human being. I think about Rohel Aguilera, the truck driver who was originally sentenced to 110 years in prison after a car crash that killed 4 people. And then I think about Ethan Couch, who also killed 4 people in a car crash, except unlike Rohel, Ethan was under the influence and driving with a restricted license. But Ethan wasn't sentenced to 110 years in jail. Ethan was given 10 years of probation and therapy. And every case has its own facts, but that's the point. The rule is never applied in a vacuum. It passes through prosecutors, judges, resources, narratives, sympathy, race, class, public pressure, and whether the person in power sees you as someone who made a mistake or someone who deserves to be made into an example. Now, thankfully, after public pressure, Rohel's sentence was reduced to 10 years, but still, the question stays with me. How can a rule claim to serve justice and yet produce outcomes that feel so morally different? And at what point does consistency become cruelty? I think about hijab laws in Iran and how inconsistent enforcement can sometimes be even more psychologically violent than consistent enforcement. Because when a rule exists but is not always enforced, people do not become free. They become anxious. They are forced to calculate risk constantly. Can I show my hair today? Is this street safe? Is this officer in a bad mood? Is there a camera nearby? Will I be fine because everyone's doing it? Or will I be the one they decide to punish? And the courage of Iranian women refusing to comply en masse is extraordinary to me. There is power in numbers. There is safety in numbers. But I also think about their mothers at home, the anxiety of knowing that your daughter is brave. And that bravery does not always protect you from a system that still has the authority to hurt you. Of course, I think about people of color living in America, because for a lot of people, the question isn't simply what is the rule, but rather who becomes suspicious before they even break one. I think about how we learn rules as children, like cutting in line. We ostracize the kid who tried to disrupt the system. And honestly, sometimes fairly. Lines are one of the first places that we learn justice. You were here first, I was here second, we wait our turn. But even as children, we complicated the system. We saved spots for friends. We negotiated. We persuaded. We said, she was here, she just went to the bathroom. We made exceptions. And then as adults, we understand that a line is not just a line. If someone is elderly, pregnant, disabled, injured, or carrying a crying baby, we adjust. I think about borders because we already understand migration when it happens inside of a country. If a guy from Ohio moves to Los Angeles to chase an opportunity, we applaud him. We say good for him. We say he made it out. We call it ambition. We call it reinvention. But if a guy from a bit further away from another country decides to move to Los Angeles to chase opportunity, suddenly he's not ambitious. He's suspicious. He's not pursuing a better life. He's taking resources. But if I wanted to move to New York tomorrow, I would not need to show any paperwork. I would not need permission from New Yorkers. I would not have to prove that I deserve to be there. I would just pack my bags, book a flight, and start paying $24 for a salad. No one would say, New York is crowded, stay in California. No one would say, you're stealing opportunities from real New Yorkers. No one would say, wait your turn. They would say, welcome. Your broker's fee is $9,000. In law school, they warned us that New York and LA were competitive cities. Higher salaries, higher cost of living, higher expectations. But it was never framed as a reason that you weren't allowed to go. It was just a warning that more would be demanded of you once you got there. So why does movement become immoral? Only when a person moving was born on the other side of a border. Why is one person chasing a dream and another person invading? Why is one person ambitious and another person illegal? I think about language. I before E except after C, except for all the times that's not true. I think about the English word laughter and how it looks nothing like how it sounds. I think about all of the rules that we memorize to survive systems that don't always make sense. And again, I'm not anti-rule. I'm actually very pro-rule when the rule is doing what it promised. I like contracts. I like due process. I like food safety regulation. I like knowing that when the light turns green, the general expectation is that everyone else is not about to improvise. Rules are necessary, but they're not gods. They are tools, and tools have to be judged by what they build. A hammer can build a house. A hammer can also break a window. A rule can protect the vulnerable. A rule can also punish people for not fitting into categories that they did not create. So yes, learn the rules. Learn them well enough to understand their purpose. Learn them well enough to know when someone is using the rules to manipulate you. Learn them well enough to know when obedience is integrity and when disobedience is conscience. Because people can survive losing. What they cannot survive is feeling like the same rule wouldn't have been applied if the jerseys were switched. That is true in soccer. That is true in court. That is true at borders. That is true anywhere that people are asked to trust a system. So again, learn the rules, but keep your eye on who's holding the whistle.
نعم، اتعلم القوانين بس خلي عينيك مفتحة على مين اللي ماسك الصفارة.